As the news of Constantine's death was spreading, Constantius, being nearby, went to Constantinople to organize the burial at the Church of the Holy Apostles. Summer 337 lasted without any Caesar seizing power for now, even if the succession had been somewhat settled with regional associations for each Caesar. It was unclear who was to take the lead of the empire. Suddenly, a great massacre happened. Hannibalianus, Dalmatius as well as other family members were killed. The most likely candidate who would have given the necessary orders for such a massacre was Constantius himself. The three sons of Constantine met on September the 9th in Viminacium to debate over what will happen next. The brothers, after some negotiations, and in front of the army, agreed to share the empire between themselves and took over their cousins' territories. Constantine II, as the elder sibling, gained authority over his 17-year-old brother Constans. Constantius, meanwhile, in his eastern provinces, was allowed to act independently and started a long, defensive war against the Romans' eternal rivals. As Constans reached majority, he wished to gain effective independence from his brother. Constantine was not willing to give up some of his power without compensation, so he asked Constans to cede the African provinces in exchange. However, this deal was not really suiting his younger brother. In 340, while Constans was busy on the Danube, Constantine marched an entire army in Italy under the pretext of bringing assistance to Constantius against Persia. His real motivation, however, was without a doubt to take what he wanted from his sibling. Constance's men ambushed and killed him near Aquileia, seizing the other half of the west in the process. In the following years, he campaigned on the borders from Hadrian's Wall to the Danube. This decade, indeed, displayed frequent military activity from both brothers, as well as a religious conflict between them. Constans was a defender of the Council of Nicaea, while Constantius was primarily Arian, and it is even possible that, by the end of his life, their father, Constantine the Great, became somewhat sympathetic to Arianism. Those tensions materialized with councils like that of Sardica. Such religious meetings were not very conclusive. However, Constans managed to pressure Constantius enough to obtain concessions from him. Athanasius of Alexandria, as well as other Nicene bishops exiled by Constantius, were allowed to return in the east. In Gaul, discontent was growing. Constans became unpopular, and the army proclaimed Magnentius as emperor in January 350. The Western Augustus attempted to escape, but was caught and executed. Hearing this, and still mired in the Sassanid War, Constantius had to buy time. He recognized Vetranio, another would-be emperor, as Caesar in Illyria to limit Magnentius's expansion and prevent them to unite against him. After that, one of the remaining Constantinians, named Nepotianus, decided to seize power in Italy for around a month before Magnentius arrived and killed him. After some time, the Eastern Emperor managed to conclude a truce with Shapur, so he headed west, making Vetranio voluntarily abdicate on the way. Constantius decided to appoint one of his last cousins, Constantius Gallus, as Caesar and imperial representative in the east, as he was engaging in a prolonged civil war. The two adversaries began to clash in Pannonia, indecisively at first, until the Battle of Mursa. Constantius won a Pyrrhic victory. He made a deal with some Germanic tribes to attack the Rhine, pursued Magnentius in Gaul, and won a final victory 2 years later. But while Constantius spent his time fighting the usurper, Gallus's loyalty was wavering. Despite some successes, he was acting clumsily, faced rebellions, poorly managed a food shortage in Antioch, and carried out arbitrary executions. Constantius saw his Caesar as a growing problem, and managed to recall Gallus in the west to receive a promotion as Augustus. However, this was a ruse. Gallus was arrested and executed on Constantius's orders. The emperor noticed how frequently betrayals were happening, so he tried to rule the entire empire on his own. In 354, Constantius led campaigns on the Rhine. He took the opportunity to raise Silvanus, Magister Peditum of Gaul. Jealousy, however, infused the Roman high command, and Silvanus fell victim to a plot aiming to disgrace him despite his innocence. Silvanus, however, decided to end the confusion and usurped power in Gaul. He was ultimately killed. Barbarian pressures all along the limes, as well as the potential resurgence of the Sassanid threat, convinced Constantius that, despite his willingness to rule the Roman world alone, he was not talented enough for it. Having failed to produce an heir, and being very suspicious of his generals, he decided to raise his last possible choice, his cousin Julian. At this time, Julian was a young man, in his 20s. During his youth, he had seen his family being slaughtered by Constantius after Constantine's death. Later, he spent parts of his childhood in exile in Anatolia. During this period, he became passionate of ancient Greco-Roman literary works and eventually converted back to the traditional pagan Roman religion. This triggered the hostility of many Christians, who ended up calling him the Apostate. On November the 6th, 355, summoned by his cousin, he was proclaimed Caesar in Mediolanum and married Helena, Constantius' sister. The first task, which was entrusted to him, to protect Gaul from the Germanic invaders. Constantius was well aware that Julian's personality was far from that of a soldier, but he hoped that, at least, his cousin would remain loyal. Surprisingly, Julian took his new responsibilities very seriously, spending the time he had in Vienna to learn and develop the necessary skills for the coming campaign. In 356, it began. The first months were quite successful. Julian and his men made some gains. However, the Caesar soon experienced disloyalty from his generals. They doubted his abilities and constantly spied on him for Constantius. At one point, Julian was besieged and had to resolve the situation on his own. Clashes with the barbarians continued into 357, and as Julian once again found himself alone, he was confronted with a large Alemannic army. Despite the odds being clearly against him, the young Caesar marched toward them, and the two armies met near Argentoratum. The Germanic host was probably reaching 30 to 35,000 men, while the Romans were no more than 15,000. The engagements started on the right, where Julian had amassed his cavalry. Conodomar, however, the Alemannic king, had mixed light infantry along with his cavalry, and it proved to be disastrous for the Roman cataphracts. Soon they started routing. The Caesar rode to meet them and managed to rally a large portion of his horsemen. The Germanic infantry launched a massive assault all along the Roman first line, and the troops hidden in the forest decided to attack the Roman left wing. The enemy cavalry, meanwhile, was not able to capitalize on its successes. As the battle progressed in the center, the Roman line was split in half, but kept fighting. The left wing, however, was winning its engagement. Soon, the Roman second line came to the aid of their comrades. The tides of battle turned, and the Alemanni, pushed back, began to rout. The Romans pursued and inflicted some 8,000 casualties. Conaudomar was captured and the routed enemies fled across the Rhine. Building on his successes, Julian spent the next 2 years cleaning up the borders and administrating the west. Constantius, meanwhile, was leading his armies on the Danube. When he learned of his cousin's accomplishments, he surely was satisfied that the campaign was a success. However, he had probably wished to see Julian fail, which would probably explain the behavior of Julian's generals during the campaign. Gaul was safe, but Julian was perhaps growing too popular. Wishing to test the loyalty of his Caesar, he ordered him to send troops to help against the Sassanids, which were once again attacking in 358. By doing that, not only would he be stronger against the Persians, but also would diminish the potential threat that was his Caesar. Julian's troops, however, refused, unwilling to go fight in the Far East, and acclaimed the Caesar Augustus. It is also possible that Julian triggered the betrayal on his own initiative. Whatever the exact reason, Julian tried to secure his new title diplomatically, claiming that his troops proclaimed him against his will. Constantius, having faced multiple usurpers before, was not fooled, but for now continued to hold the Mesopotamian frontier. Julian set off, and as he arrived in the Balkans, Constantius finally began to march west. But on the way, he fell seriously ill. Despite the mutual hostility of the two cousins, Constantius chose to preserve the empire's integrity and protect it from further civil wars. He named Julian his heir and died. Julian, the new legitimate emperor, took care of his cousin's funeral. Constantius was buried alongside his father in Constantinople. The bearded pagan emperor formulated his wish to return to a lighter imperial power, that of the Principate, represented by figures such as Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. He was not the distant, godlike imperial figure his direct predecessors were. He wanted to be a citizen emperor. He started by eliminating potential political rivals after a trial in Chalcedon. As part of his reforms, he reduced taxes and took care of alleviating bureaucracy and the government by removing many posts deemed unnecessary. As a Neoplatonic philosopher, he saw Christianity as a growing threat to the culture he admired and feared it would end up eradicating paganism from the empire. He did not persecute Christians, possibly observing that such strategies did not really work against them. So he decided for a principle of tolerance for all faiths, whether they were pagan, Jewish, Nicene Christian, Arian Christian, or else. His strategy was to take indirect actions against Christianity, to slowly push it aside from the elites, in hope that it would reduce its influence in the long term. The Christians, now named Galileans by Julian to mock them, lost the privileges they held since Constantine, and were now prohibited to teach ancient Greco-Roman literary works. As a learned writer, Julian even wrote an entire book criticizing Christianity called against the Galileans. The emperor invested much of his time to restore paganism's central place in the empire. He did this by restoring temples, attempting to structure the traditional Roman religion hierarchically, thus imitating Christianity. But even with such a policy, it proved to be quite difficult, as paganism, in opposition to Christianity, was in a way a very decentralized religion. The practice was very diverse depending on the location. In 362, Julian arrived in Antioch. However, the more time he spent in the city, the more strained his relation with the population became. Antioch was one of the first large cities of the empire to be Christianized. Moreover, Julian's pagan figure, as well as his attitude, differed widely from the other emperors of his time. Later, as he was preparing for a military campaign, he contacted the Jewish people. Despite the fact that they were not a pagan entity, Julian favored them more than the Christians. He allowed them to begin the reconstruction of Jerusalem's temple, much to the Christians' dismay. Through this action, he probably intended to win the support of the Jews of Mesopotamia for his military campaign against Persia. Once everything was ready, a massive offensive was launched along the Euphrates. The imperial army, victorious, arrived in front of the Persian capital, but the expected reinforcements from Armenia were not coming. Julian had no choice but to burn his fleet and retreat. During a skirmish with the Sassanid forces, the emperor was struck in the chest by a spear. The wound proved to be intractable. Brought back inside his tent, he laid on his deathbed for some time and took his last breath. Jovian resumed the retreat, but on the edge of the imperial borders, he was trapped, and as the new emperor had to sign a peace treaty, the terms of which included humiliating losses for the Roman side. In return for a safe retreat into Syria, Jovian ceded Roman Mesopotamia as well as the dominance over Armenia. Back inside the imperial borders, he rolled back the religious policies enacted by Julian. Christianity regained its prominent place. But after only 7 months of rule, he died in his sleep unexpectedly, and by the end of February, one of the military commanders was acclaimed emperor as Valentinian I. In less than 30 years, the Constantinians vanished from history, and as the last member of the dynasty, Julian distinguished himself as a pagan singularity inside a Christian-dominated elite. He wanted the religious tendencies reversed in order to revive Hellenistic polytheism. However, his short reign would only be remembered as one of the last revival attempts, as, from now on, Christianity's influence over the empire would be cemented. The future was unclear for the Romans. Civil wars, external threats, religious division, and societal changes were clear signs of the empire's decline, and even worse was soon to come.